The idea of sending a message through a wire, like we do with the internet, has always been a really groundbreaking thing. We have the internet, and it is so different from all other wars that it is hardly worth fighting.
I'm James Bonk. Welcome to Snut Club. Last year, in August, there was a Senate committee inquiring into foreign interference in Australian social media. And in the foreword to this, it says it's Australia's principal security threat. The biggest threat to security. Not border infiltration, but just other countries creating trolls or creating content or targeting Australians in one way or another through social media. So through stuff like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. TikTok is a really big one, and it's been really interesting lately because as a result of that report that was released in August, TikTok was banned from all government devices. The government was also trying to call in WeChat to be part of this investigation, and they pretty much refused because they were like, well, we don't have a headquarters in Australia. How are you going to call us into this Australian inquiry? TikTok does have a headquarters in Australia, but were also described as a bit difficult to question. So there's now a whole lot of suspicion on them. I'm not very popular on TikTok, but my videos that have gotten a bit more engagement and a bit more unusual engagement have been the ones about democracy. So I made a couple of TikToks talking about ways that you can participate by like writing a letter to your member for parliament or writing a submission to a particular parliamentary committee about a particular bill. And I got some really strange comments on those videos, and some of them were folded, which means TikTok knows that I don't want to see them because they're probably hate speech, but they haven't removed them. And I'm still trying to work out if that means other people can see them. In that Senate committee, the language that they use around different countries interfering is quite interesting. It's like explicitly targeted at Russia and China. And they declare Russia and China as authoritarian regimes. And they say that they're really quite concerned about diaspora communities in Australia being targeted by Russia and China. The rising tension and conflict between countries like Britain, the USA, and Australia, and Russia and China has kind of been characterized as the West versus the rest by someone called Anna Hill, who used to be like a foreign correspondent for Trump. Now, that's a pretty problematic way of posing it, right? There is something we call the majority world, which is most of the world, which doesn't live in a big imperial power. Any country that's not still loyal to Britain and America and is not part of Russia or China, so most of the countries in the world, they're not included in stuff like the G20, the Group of 20, economic powers, wow. So they don't, the whole international system has been quite unfair on these countries. And Russia and China are trying to position themselves in these internet wars as like a friend to the majority world. For example, China was offering loans to Tonga to help them rebuild their internet connection after a large tsunami. I'm getting the sense that the Australian government is concerned that Russia and China are going to infiltrate Australian minds with information that says our democracy isn't working, our culture is divided, the country is unfair. Now, there's something that I've wanted to make a video about for a little while. It's a court case that happened in Australia in the late 90s, early 2000s, which was really appalling and did expose Australia's failure to legislate against genocide, even though they said they would after World War II. You know I love science, and so I thought, I wonder if I shared a video about a time when Australian justice or Australian democracy had failed, would that go off? So I'm going to launch that now, and I'm just going to have a look and see what the comments on it are like. So Millie Roma went to the Magistrates Court in the ACT and said, hello, I'd like you to issue an arrest warrant for John Howard and the deputy and these two other people in Parliament. And this registrar was like, no, genocide's not illegal in the ACT case. We still haven't addressed the crime of genocide. Like, none of these court cases have actually been about whether genocide happened. It's been about whether we're going to punish it, which is really messed up. But they make sure it's not retrospective, because if they could be persecuted, if the Commonwealth of Australia could be persecuted for all the genocide that they did before 2002, we would be living in a different world.
Whew, that was fast. If you want to see the full video, you can find it on my TikTok at Bonk, James Bonk. It's been 5 months since I started making this video because every time I find out more about the topic, I realize how much I don't know. On Instagram, that video has 34 likes and 546 views with no comments. On TikTok, it has 4,321 views, 347 likes, 11 comments, and 44 saves. The comments are extremely positive. Of course, it's worth noting that this is a very small amount of data I've collected and I have a small reach with my account. But it's interesting to note in today's context because the alleged bias of TikTok as a platform is getting it into big trouble. The USA wants to ban TikTok unless ByteDance, the parent company, sells it to a US-owned company, probably because it can't control the discourse surrounding the destruction of Palestine, but there's also concerns about the Chinese government collecting data. It's a space where information that casts a negative light on the USA and its allies can spread really easily compared to Meta-owned platforms. In response to online support for Palestine and, strangely enough, a resurfacing of Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley described TikTok as a geyser of terrorist propaganda and the most effective surveillance tool for a foreign government ever invented. This is despite Meta platforms being used for Russian interference and the hyper-targeted election campaigns by Cambridge Analytica that helped Trump get in. Meta Threads is already banned in the European Union because it is collecting almost everything it can, including data on your health purchases, financial info, location, contact info, search history, and browsing history. That's from the Senate inquiry. No platform is neutral. Meta suppresses information that portrays America badly, and TikTok suppresses information that casts a negative light on China. If I search democracy on TikTok, I get results about US imperialism and violence, or think pieces about how democracy just isn't working. If I search for China, it's all very positive, of course. So how does this affect Australia? The life and death of a country. Any major power structure, a large corporation, a religion, or a country, has to maintain certain beliefs in people's minds in order to survive. Australia is a belief superimposed on a land that was violently and illegally taken by the British. Our constitution is actually an act that passed through British Parliament, and they can overturn our laws. Well, not their parliament, just the monarch. Even better. Theoretically, we can change and we can shape our government in a way that it will give more respect to the people who live here now and the people who lived here for 65,000 years or so and continue to do so. We could even vote to become a republic and have a new constitution we wrote ourselves. If we believe in the democracy, we believe that we can make an Australia that Australians want. A democracy depends on free debate in the public square and on people participating in democratic processes to shape their government. If the public debate is hijacked by other countries, or if people lose faith in the democratic process and stop participating, or if people give up on their country entirely and say, this is rotten, let's tear it down, the government loses the ability to govern. You could say the natural fault lines along which an empire or a nation usually shatters are cultural divides. We saw a bit of this in the collapse of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Imperial China, and the British Raj. If the initial genocide in Australia hadn't been so brutal and all-consuming, foreign powers might encourage the original countries to fight each other and the colonizer government. However, a lot of people who live in Australia today don't see themselves as part of those 250 original countries. The borders are very blurred. In 2021, 27.6% of Australians were born overseas, with the top migrators still being English, followed by India, China, New Zealand, and the Philippines. So if you wanted to weaken Australia and strengthen your own country, maybe you could instead create different psychological countries, completely different information landscapes for different people to live in. You can just slot them in there. It makes it very hard to have a productive debate when the people involved have completely different facts. Mark Zuckerberg actually said in 2018, in a lot of ways, Facebook is more like a government than a traditional company, and for some reason nobody seemed too worried about that. But being able to control public discussion and determine who has access to information is a huge strategic edge that many actual governments don't have. The main concern in our Senate report was actually online harassment, intimidation, and hate speech against a few groups of people. So Chinese and Tibetan Australians who criticize China, Iranians who speak out against Iran, and Ukrainians who've somehow offended Russia, probably just because they exist. And people from those communities submitted reports to the Senate. detailing how they'd been threatened and intimidated, cut off from their families, prevented from meeting with their peers in Australia, stalked, even harassed at peaceful protests. Vulnerable Australians are being prevented from participating in our democracy by force. And comfortable, privileged Australians are being encouraged to lose faith or lose interest. But would banning platforms like WeChat or even TikTok really help? Truth Hurts needed something more exciting. I have some qualms with the way the Senate report talks about foreign actors seeking to undermine public trust in democratic institutions and confidence in official messaging, disrupt the proper functioning of open media, or undermine social cohesion. I mean, that's all very real, but they're talking about the way this happens through disinformation, and I think it can also happen through the spread of true information, and I want to know how they'll deal with that. The video I posted about Niluyirima is real information. It's a tiny sample of the real injustices that prop up belief in Australia that have caused such a scale of loss and hurt that I can't adequately describe it. But if you go to an Invasion Day rally, you'll hear it from people who really know. And when I go to an Invasion Day rally, I am shocked by how much I don't know. The fact that I wasn't taught about Niluyirima in school undermines our democracy. I had to go to the protest for that. The fact that most of our news is owned by the same guy undermines our democracy, although there is a Senate inquiry about that dropping very soon. My predicament is, if this true information that undermines democracy really flies online and people see it and understand it and is recommended to a lot of new audiences, well, I think that could make our society more democratic because people would be more informed and maybe more motivated to improve the place we live in, make sure this can't happen again. But if this information shows how botched and illegitimate Australia as a concept is, would it stop people from participating in democratic processes? Would its rapid spread on TikTok be considered foreign interference? Communications technology is as dangerous and useful as a knife. The idea of sending a message through a wire, like we do with the internet, has always been a really groundbreaking thing. Remember the telegraph? A lot of people credit it to Samuel Morse, but in fact there were 18 or so patents for a telegraph floating around by the time he got his off the ground. He's famous though, because he got funding from the US government to build those long wires across the country, and he probably convinced them to buy into it by explaining its huge strategic advantage. He wrote in a letter that this mode of instantaneous communication must inevitably become an instrument of immense power, to be wielded for good or for evil, as it shall be properly or improperly directed. The first telegram he sent between cities said, "What hath God wrought?" Because I guess he was an artist, he's a dramatic guy, but also he knew the real gravity of the situation. Soon after, one of the generals in the Civil War, William Sherman, said, "The telegraph has made the war so different from all other wars that it is hardly worth fighting." Now imagine the telegraph locks in with other supercharged technologies, like the big Power Rangers mech suit. We have the internet, and it is so different from all other wars that it is hardly worth fighting. Mis and disinformation are huge industries. You could literally be a full-time troll at a troll farm, leaving negative comments from various sock puppet accounts. You could be paid to generate or circulate fake news. You could even stage a fake protest, film it, and share that online. This is all stuff that's happened. You might work for the government, but it's more likely you'll be part of a private gun-for-hire digital influence company. Or you could be part of the cyber wars without being paid. Simply viewing things, giving them traction by liking, sharing, commenting, and talking about them. Not even knowing whose agenda you're pushing. According to the researcher Zach Rogers, the real danger isn't propaganda or disinformation. They're old hat. They're a natural part of cross-cultural communication and states seeking advantage over each other. He's more worried about how no one can know anything anymore because we don't trust mainstream news and we can't trust social media. He says the target of this type of warfare is obvious enough. It is the fabric of trust which underpins and enables the most basic functionality of open society. That's right, misinformation is considered warfare. The fabric of trust, though, let me just remind you that in 1950, our Prime Minister Robert Menzies outlawed the Communist Party because he was afraid it would undermine democracy, when in fact he was undermining Australia's democracy by making a law he had no legal right to make that excluded a political opponent from public debate. The Senate report acknowledges that foreign interference in our debates is positive when it's conducted openly and transparently. We need to hear from everyone to make good decisions. So banning accounts or platforms or content that contains certain words or ideas is only going to weaken our democracy. Remember, TikTok isn't a champion of the left or the right, although it seems to be drawing controversy because of that. It's actually a champion of anything that will cause infighting in other countries. So it will radicalize people in any direction they'll go in. Same with other platforms that are dependent on your attention for their income. The Director General of ASIO started giving annual threat assessments in 2019, and every single one has reported an increase in the threat from right-wing extremists. To make it even more concerning, the number of minors being radicalized is increasing, and the age that they're recruited at is decreasing. So, what's the solution? I don't know. I know that social isolation makes you more susceptible to misinformation, and I know that a lot of our social ills are comorbid with the loneliness epidemic. I know that the more we use our phones, the more they know us and the less we know each other. Have you tried turning it off and on again?